That was a topic that we returned to again and again, because it was not just a matter of body scanners, which then was an oncoming technology, hadn't been employed up until that time, but issues like warrants and what the law should be on warrants and searches and statements and confessions and things of that sort. It's not easy. It's not easy to always be right when you're balancing individual liberty guaranteed by the Constitution and the security of a nation and its people. The Constitution exists to restrain government in its dealings with citizens. But the Constitution also exists to invest a president and a Congress with the power to give us what we refer to as ordered liberty. And ordered liberty means you do strike a balance. Individuals are not free to do anything they please, especially if they impinge on the liberty of others or the security of others. And the first duty of government, I've always believed, is to give people a society which allows citizens to be safe, to be secure in their homes, in their places of business, in their schools, in their churches or temples, in the street. Because if you don't have that, nothing else the Constitution guarantees can work or exist. Sure. So you're always balancing. The Congress does, the President does, and we paid a lot of attention to that, I think. The TSA, in many respects, has almost an impossible job. They deal with millions of people every day. Their goal is to get people where they want to go safely. Now, one of the issues that we always worried about was that sometimes our security forces, and I include the TSA, are reactive instead of being proactive. You know, nobody had to take their shoes off in the security line at the airports until one wacky guy coming over from Europe tried to light explosives in his shoe. Since then, every American has had to take his shoes off to get on the airplane, and we haven't had another single incident. Surely the technology exists that could pick up something wrong with your shoes if they were jimmied up, you know, to make mischief. And this business of the pat-downs, you know, I get a little cynical about that. I remember going through a security line and the guy says, well, I have to pat you down, but don't worry, I'm going to use the back of my hand. I said, that was really reassuring. Sure. You're going to use the back of your hand, not the front of your hand? I mean, give me a break. Yeah. And some of the examples we've seen of their, you know, searching 92-year-old grandmas or 6-year-old toddlers, or it goes too far. And when you have a large force like the TSA, you'll always have some people in the TSA who are doing it wrong. And so you got to think ahead, not think behind. That was one of the failures, I think, of security and investigations before 9/11, was that it wasn't approached with any imagination, and we never put ourselves in the position of the terrorists, and to think about how they might carry out their criminal acts. You know, we never had the cockpits hardened before 9/11. Now we do. But if we'd thought about it, you know, and now we've changed the advice to the pilots. Before, if a hijacker took control of a plane, you negotiated with them.
It was called the common strategy.
Yeah,
and all of the airlines bought into it,
And now, if a hijacker somehow takes possession of a plane, it's the hell with the passengers and crew. That pilot's going right to a safe place.
Although, you know, it's interesting, all of this, we're in such a world driven by money. You talk about the doors. I can tell you that the data was out there about doors and the security that you would get from them, LL being the best example.
Sure.
But there's a cost associated with that we all don't necessarily appreciate. We could be flying around in tanks if we wanted to, but
Sure.
none of us would want to pay for them.
Right.
And a lot of the commission's study talked about the future and going forward and the budgetary needs. You know, as a governor, and you saw the demands on budget for whether it's education or safety or security, where do you think our mindsets as citizens should be on giving the government fair deference for defense costs and security costs versus social service needs being fulfilled? How do politicians kind of balance those things?
Well, for me, and I think for most politicians, you would go back to the concept I just talked about, which is that my first obligation as a governor would be to give the people of Illinois the safety and security of a civilized state and to protect them from crime and acts of terrorism. And if I can do that, then I can see to their education.
Right.
Then I can see to help for senior citizens. Then I can see to Medicaid for poor people who are sick. Then I can do all the things that you would expect a government to otherwise do. But if I can't do safety and security first, I can't do the rest. And so I think the first obligation always is to safety and security. And maybe it's also because of the fact that I came out of law enforcement.
Right.
And I think that I may have a respect for law enforcement and its apparatus that maybe is a little more nuanced than the average citizen who doesn't deal with them every day.
Right.
But you know, the truth is you can do both.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are extremes you could go to in law enforcement that you just can't, you just wouldn't go to because they don't necessarily work and they're too expensive, all right? Yeah. But the same thing is true in anything government does, you know? You got to be balanced.
See, that's frankly, that's where when people, at the beginning of the show, I mentioned, you know, the great respect at the risk of being patronizing that I have for you. But I think that's where we were so fortunate to have someone like you on the commission, because you have a sensitivity and a background from law enforcement that gives you an insight that we as citizens maybe don't necessarily have. And so when you think about that and you reflect upon that report, and given the future recommendations that were made, are there any sensitivities that you think really need to be addressed that your law enforcement background tells you that we should, where we as normal citizens might blow it off as just excessive, you know, infringement on our rights?
Well, you know, first you have to start with a context. We will never be, as long as there is strife in the world and as long as there are people who want to harm us or harm our country or harm our way of life, there will never be complete safety and security. It is impossible. Just think about it. We are a big, sprawling, virtually wide open country. Do we have agents at the borders? Yes. But if you look at the size of the borders, and if you look at what those agents are otherwise tasked to do, keep out narcotics, keep out illegal immigrants, you know, it's almost impossible to say our borders are secure. We've taken agents from the northern borders with Canada and put them down on the southern borders with Mexico, simply because that's where more trouble comes from, which of course makes the Canadian border less secure. And if people, terrorists, let's say, can get into Canada and then overland down through the forests into the United States, it's still a porous border. Right. If you think about railroad tracks running across the western United States, or gasoline or oil pipelines running, they're not protected in any meaningful sense. You can get out there in the desert with nobody around for miles and blow them up. Same with bridges, for example. You could still smuggle explosives into an airport. You can just drive a truck loaded with explosives right up to the departure door and wreak a whole lot of damage. The same thing with a harbor or a port. So we'll never be completely safe and secure. We've spent billions, hundreds of billions of dollars on security since 9/11, and we've been protected,
Right.
judging by the lack of incidents in that 10 years, at a great cost. But you can think of simple schemes that terrorists could employ. I could send a group of 10 people into 10 different grocery stores in big cities, supermarkets, and have them go over to the fresh fruit or vegetable section and have a pump up their arm which sprays toxic poison on there, and people would fall ill in 10 cities at once, and then some
Right.
group could come out and claim credit.
Right.
People would be eating out of cans for the next year. I mean, look what hackers can do.
Right.
And how they can risk financial institutions. So there are very, very few ways to assure the people of the United States that they're going to be safe and secure. So it's a combination, I think, of vigilant effort, citizen awareness, to be aware of what's going on around you and to report any suspicious activity, and those billions of dollars, and crossed fingers that you're doing things right. Now, Al-Qaeda, in the intervening 10 years, has preferred to wreak havoc in London,
Right.
or Italy, or Indonesia. They've tried their plots out on other parts of the world. They've been busy in Iraq, obviously busy until recently in Afghanistan, although they're now largely over the border into Pakistan rather than Afghanistan. So they've had other fish to fry in the intervening 10 years, but mark my words, they'll be back.
Sure. And your commission's work in some fashion has continued. I know that the bipartisan leadership of the commission has, in the past 10 years, not only addressed Congress several times in various committees of Congress, but also has issued some recommendations about the implementation or lack thereof of the 9/11 Commission's 43 spot-on recommendations. How are those things unfolding in your mind in terms of what the public should expect or be sensitive to or willing to accept by way of security measures that need to be taken to protect us from the things you described?
I would say about 90% of our recommendations have been enacted. Mm-hmm. There are some that still stick out. For example, radio communication dedicated to first responders.
President Obama spoke of that in State of the Union address.
We still don't have that.
Right.
You've got to take spectrum from the commercial use and give it to first responders.
D-band, I think.
So policemen can talk to firemen.
Right.
I mean, that was one of the problems with 9/11 is the Twin Towers were coming down. The police couldn't talk to the fire,
Right.
and it impeded rescue efforts.
Mm-hmm.
And the Congress still has too many committees to deal with the issue of security. Our Department of Homeland Security officials spend far too much time testifying before successive committees of the Congress, House and Senate, Appropriations, Homeland Security Committee, on and on and on, when they could be doing security work instead of testifying.
Right.
That's got to be addressed.